as, yeah, under.
We'll do it as 2B.
Yeah.
Okay.
Watch the clock. My daughter tries to for like 7:15.
Okay. We can do it.
No,
We'll see if everybody else can.
no, 9:30.
Missiles.
So you kind of hard stop it.
Oh, howdy. Good evening. We're just about ready. But okay. City of Philomath Planning Commission meeting called to order. Can we have a roll call?
Gary Connor.
Here.
John Barlow.
Here.
Ben Hunsaker.
Here.
Josiah Jessen.
Here.
Timothy Mellett.
Here.
Darlene Rose. Not here. Haley Green said she wouldn't be able to join us. Ruth Causey.
Here.
And from staff, you've got Chase Burgrave and Chris Workman. We'll introduce our presenters in a minute.
Okay. First item of business is to approve the minutes from February 20th. Questions or comments or a motion?
I'll move to approve the February 20th Commission minutes.
Anybody ready to second that?
I'll second.
Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Introductions from our guests.
Great, so we'll introduce Nick Nutzler and Justin Peterson with Campo. I think COG, Campo, I'm trying to think down.
I think tonight we're with the council government.
Yeah, with COG, with council governments. Also with Campo, but tonight it's with COG. They are essentially functioning as consultants to the city with our climate friendly areas. And I won't steal too much of their thunder other than to say that I've known both of them for a long time. They're going to do great work at looking through our code and helping us make sure that our code is compliant with the climate friendly areas provisions. Obviously, the city planner, Chase, is going through and looking at things that we're interested in. These are going to be things that we're really required to do in order to comply with the state. So there'll be a little bit less, do we like this or don't like this? Like it or not, we'll plug our nose and we're going to have to do a lot of the stuff that they're saying we have to do in order to comply with the state. So they've got a PowerPoint presentation. I believe they're ready to share, so I'll go ahead and turn the time over to them.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Some of you might be a little bit familiar or not familiar at all with the climate-friendly areas work, but it's part of the larger climate-friendly equitable communities, and this is kind of one part of the larger effort in code update and changes. So we had and we're calling this the code concepts meeting to kind of just high level look at kind of what the code updates will need to be done. We're not getting into the detail of text edits this meeting, but that would be at future meetings. And just for some high level context, the way all of this started, so back in 2020, there was an executive order that was signed to reduce and regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And the Department of Land Conservation and Development, based on this executive order, went through a rulemaking process that was pretty extensive, and they were in charge of the land use rule updates. So they kind of through 2020 to 2022 went through this rulemaking update, and then kind of as part of that, there were certain requirements that cities have to make in terms of changes. So So in kind of the first part of this climate friendly areas, or CFAs, so kind of shorthand call throughout the presentation, was a study, a CFA study had to be submitted by the city. So that was submitted at the end of last year, and then there were some public meeting processes throughout last year to kind of basically look at potential areas within the city for CFAs. There was also Nick and I were kind of the leads on the council of government side, and there was also a consultant that was part of the process that helped with public outreach, specifically looking at potential impacts to disadvantaged communities. There was a consultant, a part of that phase of the project as well. And kind of where we are now, we have until 2024 to do the text edit code updates. So now, kind of from now until December, the cities have to have those line changes made for the code to be compliant with the rules. And then this is a different look, but kind of similar in terms of project schedule. Kind of in the green text box, that's kind of like what was already completed for the CFA study phase, and then kind of looking into 2024 with the orange there, kind of what has to be done in this next year. Here, just real quick meeting logistics. We're just going to provide presentation, and then we'll be available for questions on the code updates, code concepts as well, as you have questions, and then just to provide comments as well. And as Chris mentioned, some of the code updates are kind of what the came out of the rulemaking process, so there's not a ton of flexibility. There is flexibility in kind of where the CFA is selected, but that's kind of through that initial process, the city was able to kind of define a proposed area that I'll get to. Just in general, kind of what is a CFA? Hopefully I started that one's a little small, but kind of thinking of existing or planned urban centers, so downtowns or neighborhood centers, or transit-oriented corridors or served corridors. Generally, will have high-quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit services. They can, in terms of the land use, allowing a mix of uses, including residential, retail, shopping. So again, it's some downtown mixed-use type development that you traditionally see. And then there's specific land use requirements in terms of density, block lengths, heights that are required to be a part of the code updates. And those are intended to kind of support future pedestrian, bicycle friendliness of the area. And then kind of getting into the dimensional or locational standards for CFAs. So it has to be at least 25 acres. In the case of Paloma only has to have one climate-friendly area. The larger cities in the region, Albany and Corvallis, have to have multiple CFAs. So they have a little bit stricter standards. And then a minimum width of 750 feet. So it's some clarification came out of this throughout the process, but essentially you'd have to fit a 750-foot diameter circle within your CFA. And then there were some kind of locational standards in terms of not being located where the 7 areas subject to natural hazards. So the intent there was not to put a CFA on a steep slope or somewhere that's subject to natural hazards. And then just real quick on kind of the approach that the city took through the CFA study process. So the goal was to align with a lot of the work the city was already doing, to not recreate the process in terms of creating mixed-use areas. There's already a 2020 Main Street plan that the city completed, kind of focusing on areas adjacent to existing transit service, and then candidate areas were presented during those initial CFA meetings. And that was to get public input on kind of where the proposed or ideal area for the city would be. So kind of out of the CFA study process, this kind of was after talking to the city, kind of the proposed CFA for the city of Wilmette. So you can kind of see roughly from 12th to 15th, and then a half block north of College, and then about a block south of Applegate in terms of the proposed CFA area. And you'll kind of see that there's multiple zones, existing zones within the CFA. So you have your core. So the darker blue, kind of your core C1 zone, and then adjacent, there's a little bit of C2, the office residential, and then R2 existing within the CFA.
Just to compare Paloma's approach to, we also, as Justin mentioned, worked with Corvallis and Albany and Corvallis. All took a similar approach where they're doing a lot of kind of mixed use zoning work right now, and they aligned the CFA work with a lot of those areas. Albany took a different approach where they tried to identify vacant land, and then kind of identified those for potential CFAs. The challenge there is, I think we figured out they have to change 6 or 7 zones, and so a lot more changes for there. But they would, thinking that it would be more likely that they. So, kind of both approaches were good.
I mean, but we can leave, in those areas, we can leave those different zones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about the code concept approach.
Yeah, well, I think we talked about that, and I don't know what, something you said made me, maybe it was one zone.
That was Corvallis' approach. They're like, we already have the zone designation. It's awful close. We're just going to make them mirror each other. Along with the sinking overlay approach, they both are acceptable.
Gotcha.
This covers a little bit what I kind of already mentioned with that proposed area, a little over 30 in size, so meeting that 25 acre requirement. What they're looking for with CFAs is that there's key activities within walking distance. So Mary's River is a close park, City Hall, library, so within walking distance.
But they're not within the CFA itself,
Not within the CFA. No.
and that's not a requirement,
No, your City Hall doesn't have to be within this.
or any of those that you've, because none of those that you talked about are within the CFA.
Yeah,
They're all outside the CFA.
No, thank you for that question. It's a good clarifying question. Those all those activities don't have to be within the CFA. They did want to see that they were located kind of nearby. That walking, biking feel, but not a requirement that City Hall or the library CFA. There is a little bit of I don't have a map of this, but a little bit of floodplain on the south end of the CFA. As awareness there are the additional standards when development happens in the floodplain, and then transit facilities on Main Street and toll gates and the existing transit facilities. And
Okay, I got another question, 'cause, I mean, looking at this, I'm looking at on Applegate, there isn't a single bus stop in that area. So we picked the CFA, I'm just questioning why this, because I remember seeing that there was 3 CFAs proposed, and we've picked one that none of the public uses are within it. There's no public use within this CFA at all that I can see. 2, there's no bus stop. Well, that could be easily remedied, but I mean, I'm just really questioning the wisdom of that. If we're trying to take a rural environment with 5,600 people now, somewhere around that number, and we're trying to overlay an urban environment on top of it, and we're trying to make it pedestrian oriented, where we want people to walk to point point A to point B. There is no, I mean, if you're designing a shopping center, you create an anchor store that brings everybody to the shopping center. You guys are both planners, I take it. So there's no anchor here. There's nothing to bring the people into this other than saying, well, we're gonna have a nice downtown, we're gonna have this or that. But we're not taking advantage of any of our existing assets. We're not taking advantage of the museum or any of these things that in an ideal environment, you would want people to come visit the town and then you'd want them to visit downtown, but also have that, use that area around it.
Not talk about where it is and what it is right now, but let's keep going through the presentation.
Yeah, I can answer those questions later too.
That's fine.
Yeah.
It's appropriate, living.
And kind of just noting kind of the bike and pedestrian facilities in terms of the ongoing downtown safety and streetscape project in terms of future updates around safety. And I'll kind of get into actually some, not just the code updates, but some other aspects of that we'll be working on as well with the CFA work that kind of connects in with the bike and pedestrian facilities.
Is walking distance defined in the rule?
That's a good question. I would have to double check.
I can look too. I wonder if you.
I don't remember it being defined.
I believe they define the quality of the pedestrian facilities, so that, sidewalks that are buffered or that have shade trees. I don't think they specify a walking distance.
Then kind of getting into the code amendment approach that's proposed. So amending the first part is amending the existing C1 zone to meet the CFA standards. So knowing that kind of the core central area of the CFA, amending those standards in the C1 zone, and then also kind of creating an overlay district for the remaining CFA areas. So those other 3 zones that are currently within the CFA, creating an overlay to make sure that those areas also meet the CFA standards, but that would not affect the remaining areas that are zoned, say C2 within the city, only the areas within that overlay boundary. And then, as I mentioned, final adoption by December 2024. And then there's some specific streetscape and block requirements, which here, I think the city at the most will have to make really minor changes are expected. The city already has streetscape requirements, so it's just really ensuring that as new development happens, there's street trees, adequate lighting, landscaping, create like a walkable feel within the area. And this is really already, I'd say, and Chase, you could step in, pretty already covered, I think, within the city. And then also a block length standards. So here it's trying to ensure that the maximum block length is limited, but kind of looking at the existing code language within the city of Paloma, it would just be for larger sites, which there might not be that happening within the Paloma CFA, since it's the larger sites, larger than 5.5 acres, which kind of given the existing block feel within Paloma, that's not expected to be an impact, but is a change from the 450 or 350 to 400 feet, or reduce 400 down to 350. Sorry, but a really minor change, I would say, overall in terms of the streetscape requirements. And then we're allowed, so CFAs have certain allowed uses requirements that would have to be allowed within CFAs. Here is kind of where some changes will start to have to happen within the code. So multifamily and attached single family. So the C1 will require an update. With the attached single family or townhomes, that we did get a clarification from our DLC DLCD staff that those would have to be allowed within within the CFA and on the bottom floors, whereas multifamily, you could have the upper floor mixed use style development. So that was a clarification and something that I think a lot of cities have pushed back on, is that town homes aren't necessarily something that some downtowns want, but based on the rules and how they were written, attached single family are required allowed use. I think it's something that the city can not encourage, I guess is a good word, in kind of protecting some of that core commercial area. But that's something that we did ask questions on and kind of push back on DLCD a little bit in terms of that portion of the rules. And I'm sure there might be questions on that too. And we can get to those questions once I get through all the allowed use requirements. So office type uses, non-auto dependent retail.
Can I ask a question on that? And it's just saying what can be, that use or requirement. Does that mean that if it's an auto-dependent retail, it has to be excluded?
Yeah, so
The reverse of that statement?
Yeah, so auto-dependent retail, so like a drive-through.
And that's the definition of auto-dependent retail, is a drive-through?
That's a good question in terms of definition. I'd have to see if that's defined, but it's kind of thinking of a traditional auto-dependent retail or restaurant. It would be like a drive-through where you don't have a lock-in. But I can see it.
Thank you.
Is that something we might want to add as a definition potentially into the code?
I think our current code references drive-throughs and then also auto sales, I think, is listed in there, and there's a few other specifics. So, a big car lot, any type of drive-through activity. I don't think it goes as far as like a auto parts store. I don't think that would be excluded because that's just a retail, even though it's auto parts. So there's some language in our code that defines that currently.
And then kind of another place where an update would be required is the rules require that childcare, schools, and other public uses are allowed within CFAs. I think the intent there is to encourage kind of city halls or other type of public uses to be allowed within CFAs, not required to be. So there wouldn't be a requirement that city hall has to move, but it's just allowing public uses to be built within CFAs. And then here's the density requirements for CFAs, so that we can't have a maximum density limitation. We can't limit the number of residential units. We can't say a maximum of 30 units per acre within the CFA. And then kind of here, I'm going to get into kind of the first option of the prescriptive path, and then also there's a second option in terms of how to meet the density requirements. So the prescriptive path is a minimum density standard of 15 units an acre, or for mixed use buildings having a floor area ratio of 2.0. And so the 2.0 floor area ratio is essentially if you had a say a half acre site, and then that say that the full site was built out and it was 2 stories, that would be a 2.0 floor area ratio building. And that's visually a way to kind of think about floor area ratio standards. And in this prescriptive path, there would have to be also the allowed building height would have to be 50 feet. Right now, the current code has 40 feet, but there's also allowance for residential to go up to 50 feet. I don't think there's any examples within the city now that kind of have that. And then also just a clarifying note here, any development, even if the allowed height was 50 feet, would have to coordinate with the fire department and make sure that all of the those concerns and requirements were met.
I got confused by the 2.0 floor ratio. So if the first floor commercial was 10,000 square feet, how much residential would you have to have?
So
20,000 square feet?
for, I guess, and this is probably, I'm gonna jump forward to the commercial. So there's kind of three things that I think could happen out of in a CFA. Is one is commercial only development. So you could have a single story commercial only development, and right now there's a height requirement of 20 feet for commercial only. So that could be something that's built kind of on the ground in a CFA. And then for mixed use, that's where the 2.0 floor area ratio comes in. So if you had a bottom floor commercial and then an upper floor residential, you would have to meet that 2.0.
And how much was that? I didn't quite understand what the 2.0 is.
Yeah, and it can depend on.
So if the commercial is 10,000 square feet,
Mhm.
how much square feet do you have to have of residential?
Well, it would
10,000 or
depend.
20,000?
It depends on the site. So you start with the site area, so that the vacant land on the ground.
Oh, the ratio is the
Yeah.
land
Yeah, to
to
the
the total
building
square footage of residential?
of the buildings. So you would include the commercial portion, the 10,000 square feet, and the residential portion. That, however, say it's 10,000 square feet too. So that's if it's 20,000 square feet total there, and then that ratio is compared to the acreage on the ground.
So if your acreage is 40,000 square feet, you have to,
in that case,
what's the 2.0? What divided by what?
yeah, and that's the for it and kind of the diagram, which is actually of course covered by the
Maybe that's part of my problem.
text.
There's your equation. Oh, okay, there we go.
Yeah, it's the floor area. Thanks, Chris. For
The floor area divided by the site area has to be twice as much.
2 or more.
So if you have an acre of land, you'd have to have 2 acres of floor area in the building. Okay. Thank you.
And that was something that was brought up to DLCD in terms of smaller communities, the challenge of having a 2.0 floor area ratio actually built out on the ground within the city. That's where that alternative path comes in. So they originally, this is a part of the rules that was actually changed. They had this weird housing jobs ratio that was really confusing. The rules were updated to where there's a possibility for a 1.0 floor area ratio, which I think in terms of the case of a smaller city like Paloma would be much easier to meet than a 2.0 floor area ratio, because as you mentioned, there are that 2.0 floor area ratio, you would have kind of at a scale, the 2 stories on say an acre, and you'd need 2 stories of building on that full site, that full acre site, to meet the 2.0 ratio. And in this this alternative path, it's very similar in terms of the minimum density for residential. Just to clarify here, that 15 units an acre residential likely would be, say, I'll go back to the diagram. So for the south end of the proposed CFA, say there was a multifamily proposed, no commercial component, that new multifamily would have to meet 15 units an acre for strictly just a multifamily development. That floor area ratio is coming into play for the mixed use type development, which you're probably more likely to see kind of more in the core part of this CFA, I would say. And that, back. And in order to go with the 1.0 floor area ratio, essentially cities have to prove, they have to, through our findings, we have to demonstrate that a zone building capacity of at least 60,000 square feet per net acre. So that's, it's not quite, it's a little confusing. It's not quite a 2.0 floor area ratio, because if you had a 2.0 floor area ratio, that would be roughly 83,000 square feet, 86,000 square feet. Yeah. And so you're looking at, we'd have to prove that based on Columbus development standards, height, setbacks, if there were any, that a 60,000 square foot, you could build 60,000 square feet on an acre. So say there was a block that's exactly an acre within the city, that we prove that you could build it. Because we don't have any examples within the city where we could, because you could also point to something and say, oh, this was built in the last 5 years. I don't think we have that example. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And so it's more proving that that could be built. And then we could use a 1.0 floor area ratio, which I think is more realistic for future development within the smaller cities that are subject to these rules. So it's quite, I know it's confusing how it was worded, but that's the primary difference there is floor area ratio 2.0. I did ask DLCD if they had more diagrams or examples, and they didn't have anything. So that's something that I'm hoping they would have had. Or diagrams.
They have examples of language that's compliant with these criteria.
They no, but they offered to review language if we put it in.
Everybody read it themselves.
Yeah.
I didn't tell them for wrong.
And we'll have some examples.
Yeah.
As I've looked at this, I'll just point out, I mean, as we've been told, if you're just gonna do a commercial building, build your commercial building. If you want to add residential, now there's an additional layer of rules that comes in for building residential above commercial, which frankly just makes it harder to build residential on top of commercial. So the rules that they're implying are doing the exact opposite effect of what they were intended to do, which was an encourage mixed use. They've made it so difficult with their regulations. We've already talked to 2 landowners, Chase, in the last 2 months. We said, hey, what about going up? And they start looking at the rules like, yeah, I'll just do the single level commercial. I don't want to mess with, one, I don't want to mess with being the landlord. That's the first thing I say. But 2, I don't want to miss all the rules and regulations on trying to make this work and whatever else. I'll just build my commercial building.
And everything.
So,
And that seems like that situation would likely drive developers to larger, more dense city type areas.
Other questions on this part?
Well, I have a list of questions so far, but is that the end of your presentation?
Q&A at the end.
Yeah, we can get into the Q&A.
Rather let you guys get into your presentation than bombard you.
And then here, this is just quickly to kind of demonstrate what would happen on the ground. This, as I mentioned, is only development, so that single story commercial only, which is predominantly what's in the core part of the existing town. Then residential only, the 15 units per net acre. I would say this is more what you might see on the north or south end, potentially, of the CFA in terms of traditional residential development that would be subject to the minimum density standard. And then the mixed use meeting the floor area requirement, whether it's the next steps through the next couple of months working on the code text edits, and we're going to try and coordinate as much as we can with what we're already working on that in terms of code updates to not complicate the process or your existing work that you're already completing. Other next steps that are kind of part of this process, so a parking inventory. You wanna delay that out to June or July, hopefully, when some of the more of that streetscape is complete to get it. This inventory is really just a general, an account of number of spaces kind of on Main or Applegate and then all adjacent side streets to get a general idea of here's how many spaces. And also on an estimate on private lots as well. And then out of this we'll come up with some parking strategies. This doesn't include, sometimes parking studies will include demand studies in terms of where the highest level of demand is. But this is kind of just a simple parking inventory and then some potential strategies that the city could implement. And then a transportation gap summary. So this will kind of look at bicycle pedestrian gaps within the CFA, what infrastructure already exists, and where those gaps are that need to be improved. So with the new improvements kind of on the core east-west part of town, some of that might be the connection points south. And then parking code updates. This wasn't a part of our scope with the LCD in terms of funding, but there will be some, as part of the CFEC, the Climate Friendly Equitable Community Rules, some parking code updates were also required, which I think can be merged into your existing efforts. And there's the questions. I'm sure there's lots of questions that we can kind of go back to.
Alright, well, so one of the questions was about auto-oriented uses. That what Dustin had on the slide is pulled directly from the rules. I went to look at the definition section, and they don't define it.
What's the term we're defining?
Non-auto dependent retail, service, and other commercial uses. Not defined in the rules, but that's exactly how it's written in them. I was looking at another section about trying to find some sidewalk standards, and it does say they sort of start to define auto-oriented. Auto-oriented land uses include uses related to the operation, sale, maintenance, or fueling of motor vehicles, and uses where the use of a motor vehicle is accessory to the primary use, including drive-through uses.
So any restaurant with a drive-through is not permitted. But if they just take out the drive-through, they're good? Is that kind of, I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's some opportunity for interpretation.
Based on that interpretation, how does that approach the Chevron dealer, that Chevron station that's there?
Pre-existing non-conforming use.
Yeah.
And we have that option in this, under these standards, to use that statement?
That's state law. I mean, if you got pre-existing non-conforming, you can't go in after the fact until somebody have to change their use, so.
These standards are for new
New
development.
construction. So that, I mean, if we're done, that kind of brings me, it's a nice segue into my question, going back to the map. I guess first of all, Chris, do you have any like history about how we ended up with this selection in particular?
Yeah, we went through, Chair Connor could speak to that a little bit too. I think we had 2 or 3 public meetings and we looked at different options and got feedback. Some of it was going back and reviewing criteria again and looking, originally we were looking at some that were a little more linear between Applegate and Main Street, and those didn't fit the new 750-foot radius rules that kind of came out after the fact. And but a lot of it was looking at existing development and potential future development and just where you could realistically put it. And so, yeah, I think originally we had 3 or 4 areas and it narrowed down and then it just kind of morphed into shape. And
So are we fully approved and locked in with this area?
that was what got submitted to the state as the most likely area.
And can a city change these over time, or is the idea that it gets approved and then it's like set in stone, like an urban growth boundary? It's like,
Yeah, the city's not locked in at this point. The study was just proposed areas.
will we be locked in
You'll
after this year?
you would be you're not fully locked in. I mean, you're locked in because you would have to go through the process to update your code again.
Yeah.
Um,
Just like changing any zoning. A city in the future can change the CFA overlay shape.
I don't think there's anything in the rules that would prevent you from later changing the boundary.
Our CFA covers 31 acres, and we decide we want to carve out up to 6 acres. Is that doable?
To go down exactly
Yeah.
to 25.
Or go down to some range between 31 and 25?
Yeah, I think there's the potential for that. The main thing is that you're above the 25, and then that you have we'd have to make sure that you're still meeting that 750 foot circle. Things were carved off.
So Marley, just add a little bit more to what Chris was saying about the iteration of this. There was one that looked at kind of primarily between the couplet and extending further west of town. The rules allow you to include government and religious institutions within the CFA. We being Chris, me and Justin, well, you don't really want those to redevelop in the future. So we didn't include them in the calculations, and all of a sudden, you're not meeting the minimum. And so it was kind of this constant back and forth of, you need to meet the rules. We want to do what we can to meet the intent, and also try and come up with something that's realistic. And so that's kind of how we landed on this particular area.
And at the same time, this body was looking at our zoning and rezoning R1 or C1, excuse me, and I've argued all along that a lot of our C1 code is already in line with the CFA requirements, and so this was the area we were primarily looking at to potentially expand the C1, and it just made a lot of sense to keep that here. Let's have as much of the CFA incorporated in the C1 and that existing code language as possible, but recognizing that there might still be some, could be R3, could be C2, could be some other zoning in there as well in order to meet that 25 acres. But it was really intent to have it more clear for property owners and developers to know where they are. I've never been a real big fan of a bunch of different overlays for a bunch of different purposes, but in this case, this seemed like a much bigger C1 footprint than what we wanted to do. If we are trying to have that targeted, a little bit more targeted downtown core, but we could do it with the overlay.
So can you go to the list of things that are required to be allowed in a CFA? And what does that mean if the CFA is an overlay of a residential zone? Is that saying that commercial, even though we call it or R3, whatever it has to be, because it has to be allow the multifamily.
Right. So
Does it mean we can't exclude commercial from that?
Yeah, so everything within the CFA now would, if it's a residential zone, the overlay overrides that, and now commercial would be allowed.
So there really isn't such a thing as a CFA residential zone. Any zone that's residential that has a CFA overlay is essentially not a residential zone anymore.
Well, I think it might mean we have to rezone R1 to R3 for multifamily.
No, I'm just talking about R3. Because according to that, if it's R3 and it's CFA, you can't
exclude
retail, commercial, childcare, schools, public uses. It's no longer really a residential zone the way we've used it in the past.
Okay, so that means all of these things must be non-exclusive for the entire CFA?
Yes.
That's the question, yeah.
Okay, so it's not that we can have a portion of the CFA commercial, portion
R3.
No.
in the whole area?
No, so if this is the final CFA, those 2 blocks south of Applegate are essentially no longer residential
Yeah.
zones.
We'll have to rezone them commercial to meet the CFA.
The overlay would.
Our code can be messy, but I think it'd be better to clean it up, but regardless.
Yeah, the underlying zone would still be that residential zone, but then the overlay on top of it, and the overlay would now make it so all of those area uses are allowed, which includes.
So if I'm reading this right, I'm gonna, instead of playing with that piece of property, I'm gonna play with one of them on college. Let's say college between 14th and 15th there. Okay, that's all residential today. We're planning on zoning it residential. But if I wanted to put a, some sort of commercial space on that, I'm gonna be able to put it right in the middle of that existing residential zone. That's basically R1. I mean, it's the OR, but that's fundamentally an R1 zone.
Well, if we were gonna zone it the way it's currently developed, yes.
Yeah, but I mean the way it exists today. So me as a homeowner living next door to this, I'm now the state's coming in and saying, if the
Yeah.
guy wants to put a commercial building on there, and he can put it up to 5 stories,
Right.
or 50 feet high, he can put it on there and 100% lot coverage.
Yeah, but you're not gonna find a developer to do that.
I know I'm not gonna find a developer to do that, but there's all that stuff in between.
Well, yeah, it's a small town. You might find a business that
Valid.
buys a house cheap and
It's currently OR though.
Yeah, well, the area I'm talking about, you know, south of Applegate's one thing, because they're fairly wide open. North of Main Street, and getting up off of College, that's all really residential today. And, you know, putting mixed use in there makes sense, I get that. But coming in with strictly putting a commercial
Well,
in a particular lot there, that's another whole animal.
I wanna pause the discussion right now.
I'm just asking the questions.
Yeah, I want to pause the discussion right now to say a couple of things. One is that I was hoping that if we have any of these upcoming meetings that aren't really full, rather than canceling or anything like that, I would like to get back to the map sooner rather than later to flesh out all of the residential and then some of these areas, especially now that we've had this presentation. And so I'd like to defer any of our specific discussions about the whys and wherefores about what we're gonna do for that, because I think it would just kind of bog down tonight, but I'd like to discuss it enough here that we understand the rules so that when we sit down to do it for real, we kind of know what we're doing.
Yeah.
So just kind of ground rules for the rest of tonight.
My suggestion would be, I didn't realize this whole thing started from a executive order. This needs to go to the legislature and fix it before we do anything. I mean, theoretically, you could put in that whole area, I mean, and that's not gonna happen, I would agree. But theoretically, somebody could come in and tear everything down and put in single-family houses.
Yeah. But I think that statement is kind of a political statement that's more appropriate for the letter to the editor than the
Well,
planning commission
no.
voting. We don't wanna get the city into a situation.
Well, no,
where we're suing.
I'm saying it because obviously there's some stupid rules here. And that's how you fix it is through the legislature.
Yeah, but we're not gonna change that from this body, so if the city council wants to do something extreme, but I think it's our to apply the rules the way it works for us, and then the city council would have something to complain about, as opposed to
yeah, there's a
complaining
way.
about general rules, right?
There's a way to rewrite our code and design our maps to still comply with these requirements and still be okay, even if that executive order goes away. I think we can find that middle ground.
Well, maybe just some broader context. The executive order drove the rules, but the rules are now the rules going forward.
No, I
They were challenged by a number of cities across the state. It just recently came out that they were upheld. And the other thing is these rules apply to all cities and urban areas, so you're facing some of the same rules as Eugene, Corvallis, and Portland.
Well, that's why I said,
Yeah.
talking about the legislature to fix it, I mean, yeah.
A lot of people don't disagree with you, but so far the courts don't agree with you.
Well, our courts in Oregon,
Well, there's more commentary, it's not
more
more.
Point of order.
Thank you. It's become clear that commercial cannot be disallowed in this area, but could we, through our to have residential second story or no?
So yes, a city could go above and beyond the rules,
Okay,
but
Yeah.
but then
that's a solution.
that would And they would have to, if you required it to be mixed use with the residential on top, it would still have to meet the floor area ratio standard. But cities, there's nothing that would prevent a city to go above and beyond. The part, to clarify the one part though, that's for just strictly multifamily. They separated in the rules multifamily versus the townhomes or the single family attached homes. And those you have to allow townhomes. So that is kind of a caveat, I guess, to your question, that row houses, townhomes would have to still be an allowed use, and those don't have to have commercial on the bottom. And
I think I'm confused because if I come in and want to build a row of townhomes on Main Street, and I'm gonna take out commercial properties, businesses, do you have to allow that?
So the zoning, and this is where we did push back, and the city's pushed back on it, would have to allow the townhome developments, and they would have to meet the 15 units an acre.
But on a commercial lot, let's say, let's talk along Main Street. Let's talk along Main Street. What Commissioner Causey is asking is if you're saying within this, we have to provide all these different options and we can do it anywhere, means that you can come in and put a townhouses along Main Street and be in compliance with this overlay, regardless of whether it's zone C1 or C2 or whatever.
Yeah, that's
So that's the we're going the opposite.
Yeah.
We're flipping it.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's correct. That townhomes within any of the CFA would have to be a permitted use.
So within the CFA, the developer can come in and do townhomes, and you use the term single family attached.
That's
That's
different, same thing, different terminology.
Where's that now?
They're synonyms. That's what you're telling me.
Kinda.
Yeah.
They're,
No, I mean,
they're individual lots, they're just small lots with an individual home that's connected to the house next door.
there's zero lot line.
There's no lot line homes,
Thank you.
I think
matched together.
Yeah.
I think it might be a little misleading to show the CFA map like this, because the CFA essentially trumps all zoning in those areas. It's like one big CFA zone.
Well, not quite, because those are some minimums. We have other things that
Minimums,
that
okay.
those rules don't address. So we can have some controls, but I guess it's up to courts how, I mean, we could require that townhomes have solid gold plumbing if it's in the commercial zone, and we'd probably get taken to court or something.
Well, I mean, there's gonna be valid, arguments for parking. I mean,
No, because there's parking rules that, we can't really have any parking rules in the CFA
right, I mean,
Stuff there
we have minimum requirements.
anymore.
Well, that's,
Those have to go away.
since,
Oh, no,
I'm gonna ask a question about that. Parking code updates, parking strategies, what are we talking about? What limitations is on parking? I mean, cause that's parking inventory, okay, what have we got out? Strategies based on what criteria? What are we trying to do? We trying to maximize parking, we're trying to minimize the use of cars. What based on the CFA, are we trying, what's the goal? And why are we even talking about it if there isn't a goal applied to it?
Yeah, I can take the parking strategy piece first. The parking strategies, oftentimes, well, DLCD has, in that case, they do have a guidance document. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but some cities will kind of, you have, a strategy might be an hour limitation, but it's a 2-hour maximum or a 3-hour maximum parking on street space. And then another strategy, and I'm not suggesting any of these for Philomath at this time, I'm kind of that it's just, these are things that could be proposed as a strategy. The time limits is pretty common, like initial first step, or there's parking meters,
But what's the goal of all this? What are we trying to do?
In,
Because
Seems like
on top of all this, we have this transportation corridor, quarter mile on either side of it, that we're not gonna be able to put any criteria in for parking. That we can do a project, we can't enforce, I believe the term is enforce right now, our parking codes within this quarter mile or whatever it was, either side of the transportation corridor, which in this case is Main Street and Applegate. So this is well within that. So based on that, we can't enforce any parking, but even moving forward, what are we trying to do with the parking? Because, you know, and this has been my heartache all along, is trying to understand what the goal of this is, because I hear pedestrian, I hear bicycle, I hear public transportation. And in a strictly urban environment, even Corvallis, I could argue, is close enough to an urban environment, but in a larger city, urban environment, all that makes total sense. But we're in a rural environment. You can call it urban all we like, but the vast majority of the individuals coming in to utilize the businesses that services are provided in our town is parking. So this is as far as I'm concerned, this is as big of an issue as what we've already talked about tonight. And I keep hearing that we're gonna kick this can down the street. So I need to get some idea from you, is what are we trying to do? What is it that the CFA, whatever's in the language of the documents that have been put in place for that, what is it we have to do with parking? And what is the goal? Get rid of it? Or to manage it? I mean, the solutions are,
Well,
2-hour parking.
yeah, and on the,
please answer.
the strategies, I would say that a part of that is trying to manage the parking. It exists, so you could have strategies to look at where the existing parking is and how that's managed, so as.
But are you talking just about publicly owned on-street parking?
Or it could be both, but obviously with a developer that owns a lot, you have to get them on board, because it could be shared parking.
But you're not talking about parking requirements for development at all. Right.
No, and that's the second part is where our scope as COG isn't update the parking code standards, but within that, I think it is a quarter or a half mile.
It depends actually on what kind of transit stop it is, but I'm pretty sure it's a half mile from that stop from right at the corner of the CFA. So it would fall well within.
It falls into it, even a quarter mile it falls into it.
Yeah,
If the thing's only 1,300
It's
feet
right
tall,
right
and a
next to
quarter
it.
mile is 1,250
Yeah.
feet.
prevents.
Bus stop?
What's up?
Can we move the bus stop?
There weren't bus stops in there, but there is a bus stop in the CFA, and there's one just to the west, a few feet, and then there's one about 3 blocks
The
away.
only one that's actually in the CFA is the one that's on Main Street next to La Roquita. That's what White State there was.
Okay, so that's.
But there's a
That's
whole
the-
bunch, there's
Bunch well
there's
within-
3 or 4 more within a quarter mile.
But I think some of the parking strategy work is actually a little, I think, separate. I want to tease that out a little bit. The CFA itself, the state rules say you can't mandate minimum parking.
You can't not,
You cannot mandate a minimum parking. That doesn't mean developers can't build it. It just means you can't mandate a minimum.
okay, so basically we can't require any parking within a CFA.
Correct. A developer can still build it.
I understand that part, but
And then-
from our regulatory thing, we're gonna have no language in a CFA as it relates to parking. It's a free-for-all.
Correct. And then the state rules also require within a half mile of transit stops,
Yeah.
you can't mandate minimum parking.
I understand that.
What about maximum parking? Could they just level a lot and make it a parking lot?
I've asked that question, and yes, parking structures are allowed.
When to do it,
And
9
then
block.
the parking strategy work that we've been talking about and working with the city is a little bit removed from that, and where it's, as downtown develops, as downtown becomes more popular, there's a limited amount of public parking, the streetscape project is gonna add some. And that's really thinking about, more of a, let's say citywide, but mostly downtown focused, right? Parking strategies, so as parking becomes more popular, or as downtown becomes more popular, how do you manage that as a city? So as an example, you can start with, no, anyone can park anywhere as long as they want. The next kind of evolution that would say you can only park here for 2 hours or 3 hours, as Justin mentioned. The next evolution in that is kind of paid metered parking, and it's really just to make sure that you don't have someone who's parking their car in front of a business that maybe is.
But you can, whatever off-street parking you want, which is exactly opposite of.
So, yeah, so I wanna ask some more questions about that. So if a developer does decide to buy a lot in the middle of this, level it, put it in a parking lot, is it possible for us to have requirements in our code for setbacks, greenscapes, other things that could limit the amount of actual asphalt, or is it just, what are,
Yeah,
I'm trying to figure out what our options are. I mean, I know, but I'm asking, does the CFA also trump those requirements of our code?
That's a good question. You may have to talk to DSC.
Because, yeah, I mean, we wouldn't want like a big black asphalt patch in the middle of our CFA without at least like some bushes and trees and a bench or something,
I kind of like Albany's idea, just find a empty piece of property and put it there, and then that way you don't care what happened.
Couldn't find one big enough.
I mean, I understand why they did it. They're doing it that way. No, I'm just saying.
Piggybacking off of, which is a nice question, are there landscaping requirements at all, or any sort of landscaping stipulations for?
Yeah, there are,
or hardscaping also.
there are some, maybe,
Unless it's missed that.
yeah, streetscape requirements.
Okay.
Including the streetscape, street trees and.
Yeah.
landscape.
Okay.
Where can we go to see the exhaustive rules from CFAs?
Yeah, and we can send those to Chris to share out.
And we'll be teasing those when we're looking at code language changes. When those will come forward. I don't know, it's totally helpful. Looking at changes to the code, it will be helpful.
Yeah, but I would like to have, because I tried to look at that, I guess, before the rules were made and it wasn't available, so I'd like to see it.
They're in the OARs, the Oregon Administrative Rules. That's the best place, I think. Even the guide doesn't have all the details.
Right. Yeah, 660, that's your, the planning rules, I think they were.
60.012
660-012.
dash.
In the OARs.
Yeah, and then most of our rules, there's a lot in there, but 3.1. So 660-012-3. Voting it. This is here, right? If you go to the 012 transportation planning rules.
Was there a model CFA that someone had in mind when they made the order and then developed the rules? I mean, is there something on the ground that people could look at and say, this is what it looks like, or is this an acceptable use of 25 acres?
I think the vision was like traditional downtown. I don't think they put specific pictures to the that I can think of.
Utopian-esque.
Except for the.
I didn't hear you.
Emily.
I didn't hear you say that, by the way.
And we're just the messenger.
Yeah,
I
don't
appreciate the work you put in.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, we really
Put a square peg into a round hole and some grief that I'm sure you're getting.
And we tried to like push back like on the that piece. That was the part that I really asked questions on.
And they've been to write some strongly worded letters.
And there are recognitions that we are not, we are a smaller community of its lesser population than what the ideal target for this was, but we are part of Campbell, we're part of the Corvallis area metropolitan, so we're in a metropolitan area. And there's some benefits from that, and there's some stipulations that come with that. So if we want to continue to get federal and state funds for our metropolitan area, like to pay for 13th Street and to pay for studies and to, pay for other improvements, sidewalks on 16th, sidewalk up on 11th Street. If we want to continue to get those fundings, then we're going to be active participants in our metropolitan area. And that's going to come with stipulations. So we get some benefits of being close to Corvallis, and we get some drawbacks, and that we get looked at as more of a metropolitan area than what we would if we were 20 minutes further to the west, right? We get looked at differently.
Well, I think, your point about on the single family dwellings, to me, that's the main big problem. I mean, if we want, these areas to be more commercial and then put have people living upstairs, I mean, that makes all sense. But having single family, even attached dwellings, makes no sense. I don't know how they even came up with that rationale.
And we're gonna get our code to be compliant, and then at the end of the day, the sites are gonna continue to grow and develop organically with some boundaries of what they can and can't do. But if I'm an investor and I'm looking to build housing, I'm definitely not looking off of Main Street where you got truck traffic and everything else going by and big commercial on both sides. So I mean, at some point, these things are going to develop organically, but we're just talking about what are the rules that are going to limit the extremes, right? And we want to eliminate the extremes as much as possible. The housing on Main Street is maybe one of the extremes that's getting caught in here, but I get it. Take away Main Street, you get a block up on College Street on the north end of College. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to not allow for the townhomes there. I would still argue that there's maybe other better uses there, but like I said, there's some areas where the brush is very fine, and there's others where it's a little more broad, and DLCD's implementing these rules as they go, and we're gonna find out over the next 3 to 5 years what was good and what wasn't good, and they'll make changes and it'll adapt and we'll survive. So our biggest part of this part, by the end of the year, we've got to be compliant with state law, right? I mean, that's the end of the day. And so we can continue to work with Justin and Nick on making sure that we're compliant by the letter of the law, and then we'll push and encourage development in certain areas and we'll discourage it in other areas, and the market will do that as well. So I don't have a lot of angst about these. Again, it's very similar to what we're seeing in the C1. It's just an expansion of that, and we've been talking about expanding C1 for 10 years. So here it is. All right, now it's forced upon us. There'll be some growing pains. There'll be some changes that have to be done, and we may not like all of them, but we'll get through them. We'll deal with them kind of one at a time. So I think we're on a good start, and there'll be a lot more information coming over the next couple of months. You guys have anything else?
Well, I think our proposed next step was going to be to bring back code update for a future meeting. Is that still the desired next steps?
Yeah, and I think between now and then we can look at zoning a little bit. I heard that, and we've kind of paused on. Well, we haven't looked at residential zoning at all, really comprehensively, with the commercial and industrial zoning we've looked at. So that might be a good next step for us to do before we come back and look again. It might have some impact on the final boundary that gets determined, it sounds like. So we can look at that on our end. But yeah, I think really just diving into the code, finding very specific non-compliance issues that are there now, and then recommended language for areas where we can get closer and improve. I think it'd be great.
And if folks are looking through these and have questions that come up, just send them our way. We have a really good relationship with DLCD. They're always willing to talk about this stuff, even if the answer isn't what we kind of want to do. I'm always willing to bring.
They're very happy to tell you no.
They're willing to be flexible, and have suggestions with possible. We, the benefit both Paloma, Corvallis, and Albany. None of those were involved in the lawsuit. We've been very open and very proactive in addressing this, so that goes away with DLCD. So.
And you touched on, I'm just going to mention it because you've mentioned it twice. There was a suit brought by a pool of cities. I think it was 2 counties. The League of Oregon Cities was there as well. And they pushed kind of more generally on just whether DLCD had the authority to implement. There's also some strategy on the tactics they used and notifications to the public and all that. So, but in all accounts, the court essentially said, well, we're not going to look at the broad question of whether or not they've got the authority to do it or not. We'll look at individual rules that are being made and whether there's authority there or not. But that wasn't the suit that was brought, right? The challenge was they just don't have the broad authority. But they did, I think, stood on two different grounds. One was they didn't do correct notification, and remind me, the second was more of administrative.
I think enforcement of the transportation system plan.
Right. Yeah, actually looking through that transportation plan. So there were a couple little caveats where the court ruled in favor of the others, but in general, they just said you got to be more specific on what your challenges are. And I do know that there are some cities that say, okay, we'll be very specific. Let's look at height restrictions. Look at townhomes. Let's look at these rules, and we're going to challenge these individual rules. So that is still being done, and there's there's push and shove that comes there. So definitely we can talk to city council if we want to be more involved in that process. If we feel like there's specific things, but generally speaking, you're going to find property owners and developers are the ones that have the most to gain and the most to lose, and they're the ones going to be at the table saying, we're going to challenge these things. We don't think they're right. So we can be more active there, or we can just focus on getting compliant and
Let the bigger players shoulder that burden.
yeah, let them pay the legal fees. So.
Thanks, I appreciate you driving down here.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks again, guys.
Thank you very much.
We're open to questions. Yeah, absolutely.
Gary, I thought you had a whole list of questions.
No, that was it. Tonight.
Tonight.
You're in the dare village.
Well, let's talk about our agenda real quick. What was the intent? I mean, we got this latest version. You've made some changes to the definitions, code language. I imagine somebody maybe came here ready to talk through lots of details. Spend another good 2.5, 3.5 hours going through it tonight. Other people probably haven't read it yet. And
Absolutely, and I know Chris has, I think, some other obligations. I know nobody, everybody would like to go to bed probably before 10, or maybe midnight. So if there's high level discussion we want to have about what's in here, that's wonderful. But if there's just minor modifications or you don't like this line, feel free to just email me, because I can just the code as we go along if you think there's an area. So I was hoping that we wouldn't go line by line tonight like we did the other night. We already went over the discussion anyway, but just if there was anything there.
And in the future, when we get to the point of actually having public hearings and all that sort of thing, we will be going through this again, line by line, and wordsmithing a few specific things if there's disagreements, and we'll vote on it and all that sort of thing, but we're not quite there yet. So, going around the room.
I'm just gonna ask a question. If I were to send you a whole series of comments, questions, whatever, and actually, I'm not even gonna send you a markup, I'm gonna sit down and type them out, so there's no question on my scribbling or anything else. Would I be correct in assuming that at next meeting, we would see a updated version of this with those edits? At least available to us, whether it's part of the meeting minutes or meeting agenda, or at least been distributed through email unofficially, so that I can see it, and because.
We have to vote on it.
No, this is a long process. I don't wanna go out 3 months and go back in and spend time to look at it and say, well, what happened to this? I wanna be able to, if something doesn't go in, or there doesn't happen, at the next opportunity like this, say, what happened?
I think it speeds our process up if people were to email their comments individually, and then our next packet could be those comments, and then your response is like, yep, no, and this is why, we can talk about it.
Right.
Or just like, yeah, we're gonna have to talk about this one a
Just do it
lot.
in the notes.
And
Would that be, am I correct, we don't want to circulate that amongst the entire room?
no, No, we don't wanna circulate that, we wanna see all of it after, like, right before
Go
the,
through it, yeah.
right before the next meeting. So that it has his answers, so we don't have to spend time talking about things that he's just like, yeah, and we just, and then if we see those comments and somebody disagrees, we can bring it up.
The only scenario I want to avoid is if I got like a whole new, set of code. I wouldn't want to just bring that back and be, Mr.
Yeah,
Morton
yeah,
wrote
yeah.
this, or sorry, Mr. Millett, wrote this for us.
Yeah,
Never mind. I wouldn't want that. So, but yeah, if there are lines, definitions,
I would do it as a formal document, instead of just a copy of a markup.
So Chase's focus will be not this, but the next section, right, getting into depth stuff. So he's gonna focus on that next couple weeks, wait for comments to come in. As comments come in, we'll have a document prepared to go over this, but we're gonna keep pushing forward as well, right? So we'll talk on specific things here. Hopefully there won't be too much there outside of what's in your notes and what Chase can respond to. And then he'll be spending a lot of his time, at least the next week and a half, 2 weeks, on
next section.
the next sections of commercial. and
So can we set ourselves a deadline that people have to get him, comments by April 1st? Yeah, that seems reasonable, by April 1st, so that on the 15th, we can have your responses and updates? Does that make sense?
That's fair. And like you said before, before the end of this whole process, we're gonna be going back through this section, so there should be future opportunities for other revisions.
Thanks, Tim, you had a,
That last meeting.
well, we did, but now he's responded. So, in some areas,
Now
we
we're gonna
said-
do it again.
yeah, in some areas, we said to him, hey, make this type of change, make this type of change wholesale, and now he's done that, and I'm sure we'll have comments on it.
I just have one comment. On my calendar, I show that we had added a next meeting first. Am I incorrect?
The 1st of March.
The 1st of April.
Of April.
That's what on my
Yeah,
calendar.
that's what our agenda says.
Yeah.
Okay, so we need to get him comments by the 25th and not the 1st of April.
Well, no, I was proposing that we get him comments before the next meeting, so that for this next 2 weeks, he can focus on what we're gonna see on the 1st,
Which is
And
another
then-
big chunk of tax.
which is another chunk,
Right.
but then we'll get his responses on the 15th,
Okay,
a month away, rather than 2 weeks.
okay. I
So does-
understand now. I'm sorry.
Does that mean?
But that's okay, I mean,
I didn't pick up that subtlety.
that's quick enough for you?
I don't know.
So Chase, does that mean that you are gonna carve out the next chunk and email it out for us to respond?
Oh, the next division.
Chunk that we're gonna go over on the 1st?
Well, I think Chris and I probably have some work yet to go over together with regards to that. I'll try to get you a copy prior to the next meeting.
It'll come out in the packet. I mean,
Yeah.
that'll be the first that we'll get it out to you.
So-
Will be the packet for the first.
The quicker you can get that to us, the more time we have to go through it, review, and give you our edits, the better quality response you're gonna get.
For sure.
And then just the material package, is that routinely on the website or you
Yeah, the whole
You
packet's
download
on there.
Yeah.
Just searching the planning commission agendas and it says agenda, but when you click on agenda, it's the agenda packet.
Okay.
And if you don't get far enough, we can look at the map on the 1st.
Well, that's a good idea.
It's always the
Go on
map.
meeting.
I'm dying to get back to the map.
I agree.
I don't think we've got any land use applications standing. I don't think we do. So we probably have some time. We could spend half the meeting looking at zoning and the other half looking at code.
Yeah, no, I don't think anything was gonna come before this body in the next 2 weeks.
Commercial stuff, but nothing.
Nothing type 3 or above.
So so in the next packet, can we have, the current version of the map? Cause I've gotten a little lost. I think I said that before.
You
First,
still have the email?
Yeah. We'll do the current version and some recommendations for
The
residential
GIS website?
housing.
say that again?
We will have the current and some recommendations for residential.
Okay. And the current doesn't mean the current, it means the current proposed.
Why not?
It shows
No.
It shows both. The
Yeah,
website.
I thought
It
it did.
shows current and then it shows what's proposed as new is dark black outline, and it shows the proposed zoning.
That's in the city GIS.
The GIS website?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, you're saying there's new proposals on?
No, we will make, so over the next 2 weeks, as we're looking at code and we're preparing for the meeting on the first, we will eyeball and spitball and we'll put the proposals out there. Specifically for R3 areas is what I'm most interested in, and then we'll look at around the commercial area we talked about. We've already had some discussions of areas that are zoned industrial, commercial, looking to go to residential, so those will identify and, yeah, so.
I don't think we have a CFA overlay built.
We don't, not that yet.
A layer,
Yeah, but we'll eventually get there.
that's pretty easy then.
Question about this?
Yes, that's where we're at, is staff reports. So,
What's Glorietta Bay?
The Lutman property.
What?
Lutman. The storage units and the RV park. That's the company name, Glorietta Bay.
This bridge?
It's off of Main Street.
Oh,
Main storage
yeah.
and the RV park.
What was the decision made on, for Dirt Road?
They submitted for a new building in the back of the front buildings. They're putting a brewery in the back. So it's just a commercial type 2 site design review.
Approved?
It's been approved.
Need to get us
Good
updated.
news for the city?
Yeah.
More permits on that?
School district's putting in their cover. Is that what that was for? The cover at the primary school. Yeah.
What's McGee's doing?
I don't recognize that one. That's a building permit one. I don't know. Those permits get pulled and we don't see them if it's just a building permit. It was on the application.
was it? Okay. So Nazarene denomination sold the building. So,
Double check.
Any developments on ongoing developments?
Residential development? You're doing
Yeah.
Mill Pond, or were you talking?
Yeah, Mill Pond and the apartment complex going in on Apple.
Nothing on the apartments or townhomes on Chapel. Same as last, I think they're still working on financing in this new world. I did speak with the developer for Mill Pond today. One of his loans just came through, the money that he applied for from the state's come through. So he'll have crews back on site working again. A lot of the money he was waiting on from the state was for the environmental consulting work that was being done. It's been put on pause because there's no funding. So that money's coming back in, and so he'll have his environmental consultants back out there hopefully by the end of the month. And that'll be approval for, I think, 4 houses that'll be able to come on the market once that's done. And he's in the process of another 4 or 5, and he's got another 9 that's got foundation work going. So it's coming along. It's getting there. I think we'll see more activity there. He's had crews off. Just he gets electricity. He hasn't had electricity there. He gets electricity. I think he said Wednesday. That's been his holdup. So that's why he had to pull his crews off site and put them elsewhere because there's no electricity on
The
site.
Pacific Core over there?
Pacific Power. Yeah. So he's been with electric for I don't know 3, 4, 5 months. So
What about the construction on the highway? Do you know anything about?
progress. Yeah, they littered the streets, figuratively speaking, and not so much, with pamphlets. They're looking at their paving schedule. I just saw their 3-week. They don't have any paving on the 3 weeks horizon, but you can see they're finishing up a lot of the concrete work, and they're gearing business owners up, letting them know, and getting the word out to.
it's gonna get worse before it gets better.
It will get much worse before it gets any better.
I
Yes.
feel for our local business community. That's been rough for a bunch of them.
lighter note, it looks like they're digging a new pool for us in front of Pioneer.
I saw that.
So
Wow.
if we get a good rainstorm, we'll have a place for the ducks to go. Yeah, no, there's some pretty big trenches and some big open areas, so be cautious as you're driving through town, keep your headlights on and be safe. Things are marked relatively well, but if you're not careful, you could definitely end up.
Yeah, some of those cones are right on the line.
Yeah. Everybody's
I
been,
noticed that right in here.
everybody's been safe,
Down
workers
the
are all being
ledges.
safe. I mean, just be cautious through going through town, keep your speeds down.
You mentioned paving. When do they plan to,
It'll be at least a month or so out still, but yeah, once they get going, you'll know. The biggest concern with the paving is with the elevation shifts,
yeah,
you're just not gonna be able to go north and south on a block for 3 weeks or so.
There'll be a lot of trucks moving dirt.
So we have to be going around.
Are they gonna be redirecting highway traffic up on like College?
No, they'll
portion
just
of
narrow
it?
down to one lane.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they'll flop.
It'll always narrow down to one lane, but I said the difficulty is gonna be going north-south. There may be times you can't go north on the street because there'll be a 2-foot elevation.
Because they're actively working.
Right.
more?
I was being. All right. Ready?